History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And that rhyme is far more precise than we've ever dared to admit. Look around you. The political polarization, the economic anxiety, the cultural upheaval, a sense that something fundamental is shifting beneath our feet. You felt it, haven't you? That creeping sensation that we're living through extraordinary times. Not just another moment in history, but a critical turning point. Crisis. Now, what if I told you this moment was predictable? What if the chaos unfolding around us follows a pattern so consistent, so mathematically precise, that it could have been anticipated decades ago? What if our greatest thinkers, leaders, and visionaries are merely playing roles in a script written long before they were born? The truth is unsettling. We are not the authors of our era. We are its products. And the forces shaping our lives today have shaped every generation before us in a cycle as old as civilization itself. Before we continue, if you enjoy unraveling hidden truths and uncovering the forces that shape our world, make sure to click that subscribe button. Your support allows us to continue bringing you the insights that truly challenge how we think. Now let's go deeper. In the early 1990s, historian William Strauss and economist Neil Howe proposed something revolutionary. After studying American history, they discovered that society moves through distinct phases, roughly 20 to 25-year periods, that together form an 80 to 100-year cycle. A human lifetime, what they called a seculum. This wasn't just another academic theory. It was a skeleton key unlocking patterns across centuries of human experience. Patterns that explain not just what happens in history, but why it happens, and more disturbingly, why it happens again and again and again. The Strauss-Howe generational theory, often called the fourth turning theory, suggests that history moves through four distinct phases: the sigh, the awakening, the unraveling, and the crisis. Each phase shapes a generation with distinct values and characteristics, and each generation, in turn, shapes the next phase of history. Is a perpetual feedback loop, binding us to a cycle we can recognize, but seemingly never escape. Let's examine each phase more closely, because understanding them is crucial to grasping why we repeat the same civilizational mistakes with such devastating regularity. The high follows a major crisis. It's a time of strong institutions, collective confidence, and social cohesion. Think of America in the 1950s. Economic growth, consensus politics, conformity. During the high, society celebrates unity and shared purpose. Individualism is subordinated to collective goals. The generation born during a high grows up in a protected, structured environment. They value stability and become institutionalists. The awakening emerges as a reaction against the conformity of the high. It's a period of cultural revolution, spiritual exploration, and the questioning of institutional authority. America in the 1960s and 70s exemplifies this phase: civil rights, feminism, environmental consciousness, sexual liberation. The generation born during an awakening grows up during this idealistic ferment. They become moralistic, values-focused, and often divided among themselves about which values matter most. The unraveling follows as institutions weakened during the awakening begin to decay further. Social trust erodes. Individualism triumphs over collective interests. Economic inequality grows. Politics becomes increasingly polarized. America in the 1980s through early 2000s reflects this pattern: culture wars, institutional corruption, the hollowing out of civic life. The generation born during an unraveling grows up with minimal adult supervision and protection. They become pragmatic, self-reliant, and often cynical about institutions. Finally, the crisis arrives when the problems that developed during the unraveling reach a breaking point. Institutional failure becomes impossible to ignore. Economic contradictions become unsustainable. Political divisions become unbridgeable through normal means. The old order collapses, and through struggle and sacrifice, a new one is born. The generation born during a crisis grows up during turmoil that demands collective action. They become builders of new institutions. This cycle isn't unique to modern America. Throughout history, we see this rhythm playing out across civilizations. Think about it. The greatest generation emerged from the Great Depression and World War II. They built the stable prosperity of the 1950s, the high. Their children, the baby boomers, rejected this stability during the consciousness revolution of the 1960s and 70s, the awakening. Gen X came of age during the culture wars and institutional decay of the 80s and 90s, the unraveling. And millennials and Gen Z, they're the crisis generation coming of age during terrorism, financial collapse, pandemic, and now, perhaps, the dissolution of the post-war order. This isn't coincidence, is not random chance, is a pattern as predictable as the seasons. But why? Why would human societies be trapped in this endless cycle? The answer lies not in economics or politics, but in something far more fundamental, the way generations react to and against each other. Imagine yourself born in the aftermath of a crisis, a devastating war or economic collapse. You grow up hearing stories of sacrifice, of struggle, of a world that nearly ended. Your parents and grandparents emphasize stability, institution building, caution, and you embrace these values. You build, you create order from chaos. Your generation establishes institutions designed to prevent another catastrophe. But your children, they grow up never knowing the crisis that shaped you. To them, the institutions and values you cherish feel stifling, unnecessary, even oppressive. They rebel. They seek meaning beyond material success. They question everything you built. Their children, witnessing this conflict, become pragmatic, independent, skeptical of both institutions and idealism. And their children, born into a world where institutions are failing and individualism reigns, face the return of crisis, a world coming apart at the seams, demanding collective action and sacrifice once again. This is the rhythm of generations, each reacting against what came before, each blind to the lessons their grandparents and great-grandparents learned through bitter experience, each doomed to rediscover ancient truths through fresh suffering. Consider ancient Rome. After the crisis of the Republic's fall and the civil wars, Augustus established the Pax Romana, a period of stability and institution building. The first generation born under Augustus never knew the chaos of the late Republic. They took peace for granted. As generations passed, civic virtue declined. The institutions of the Principate decayed from within. Crisis returned with the year of the 4 emperors in 69 CE. Stability was restored under the 5 good emperors, only for institutions to decay again and crisis to return. The pattern repeated until Rome's final fall. Each time, the generation that lived through crisis built institutions to prevent its return. Each time, subsequent generations forgot why those institutions mattered. Each time, decay led to collapse, led to renewal, led to forgetting. The Chinese dynastic cycle follows a similar pattern. A new dynasty emerges from crisis, establishing strong institutions and effective governance. Over generations, corruption grows. Officials become self-serving. Tax collection becomes inefficient or oppressive. Eventually, the mandate of heaven is lost. Rebellion or invasion topples the dynasty. A new one rises from the ashes. The cycle begins again. The Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, all show this generational rhythm. Strong institutions established in response to crisis. Gradual decay as generations pass. Return of crisis. Renewal or collapse. Medieval Europe provides another clear example. Emerging from the Black Death to the Renaissance, then religious wars and exploration, awakening, then absolutism and early revolutionary stirrings, unraveling, then the age of democratic and industrial revolutions, crisis, then a new Victorian stability, avant-garde movements and early social reforms, awakening, the decadence and tensions of the early 20th century, unraveling, and finally the Great Depression and World Wars, crisis. Modern America shows the same cycle with remarkable precision. The American Revolution, crisis, followed by the era of good feelings, the Second Great Awakening and Transcendentalist movements, awakening, the bitter divisions leading to the Civil War, unraveling, and the Civil War itself, crisis. Then Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, the Progressive Era and Social Gospel Movement, awakening, the cultural battles of the 1920s and economic tensions of early Depression, unraveling, and finally the Great Depression and World War II, crisis. Then the cycle begins again. Post-war stability, 60s to 70s social revolution, awakening, 80s to odds institutional decay, unraveling, and our current era of mounting crisis. The pattern is unmistakable once you see it. But here's the truly disturbing part. Even when we recognize the pattern, we seem powerless to break it. Why? Because each generation must learn for itself. Knowledge isn't truly inherited. It's experienced. Your grandparents' wisdom sounds like platitudes until you face the same challenges they did. Only then do their words reveal their depth. This is the tragic core of human experience. Societies forget, not because information is lost, but because each new generation must rediscover truth through its own suffering. The lessons of history are written in countless books, but they only become real when we live them ourselves. Consider the financial regulations established after the Great Depression. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial and investment banking. Securities laws required transparency. Deposit insurance protected ordinary savers. These institutions worked so well that financial crises became rare and contained. But success planted the seeds of failure. Generations who grew up after the Depression never experienced financial panic firsthand. The regulations seemed excessive, burdensome, outdated. The Great Moderation, economists called the late 20th century. Recessions were mild. Finance was stable. Surely we'd solved the problem of economic cycles. So we dismantled the safeguards. We removed the firewalls. We trusted markets to regulate themselves. And in 2008, we rediscovered what our grandparents knew, that financial markets, left unchecked, tend toward excess, instability, and eventual collapse. Or consider war and international order. The generation that lived through World War II understood the fragility of peace. They built the United Nations, NATO, international law, arms control regimes. They established rules and norms to prevent another global conflagration. These institutions worked. Great power war became unthinkable. International cooperation, while imperfect, constrained conflict. Peace between major states became the norm, not the exception, the longest such period in modern history. But success again bred complacency. Generations born after 1945 never experienced total war. The international order seemed bureaucratic, constraining, even oppressive. Nationalism and unilateralism returned. International institution weekend. Great power competition re-emerged. Today, we stand closer to major power conflict than at any time since the Cold War. Climate change offers another example. In the 1970s and 80s, initial warnings were sounded. The science was established. Early steps were taken. But decisive action required sacrifice, international cooperation, foresight. It required caring about future generations as much as our own. Instead, we kicked the can down the road. We prioritized short-term economic growth over long-term sustainability. We chose present comfort over future security. Now, the effects of climate change are no longer theoretical. They're here in stronger storms, longer droughts, rising seas. We're relearning through bitter experience what science told us decades ago. Some of you might be thinking, but we have history books, we have records, we have more information than any civilization before us. Surely we can break the cycle. This misunderstands the nature of the trap. Our problem isn't lack of information, it's lack of lived experience. Each generation reacts primarily to the conditions of its formative years, not to the written records of the distant past. Books can tell you fire is hot, but most children still need to touch a flame to truly understand. There's something deeper at work as well, the psychological mechanism that Howe and Strauss identified as driving the cycle. Each generation doesn't just forget the lessons of history. They actively rebel against the worldview of their parents and embrace the worldview of their grandparents. But in a new context, consider the GI generation, born 1901 to 1924. They grew up during an unraveling and came of age during crisis. They valued institutions, collective action, and social cohesion. Their children, the baby boomers, born 1943 to 1960, rejected these values, embracing individual expression, personal fulfillment, and spiritual exploration, much like the missionary generation, born 1860 to 1882, who championed similar values during the Progressive Era. The baby boomers' children, Generation X, born 1961 to 1981, projected boomer idealism for pragmatism, self-reliance, and skepticism, similar to the lost generation, born 1883 to 1900, who emerged from World War I disillusioned with idealistic visions. Generation X's children, the millennials, born 1982 to 2004, are gravitating toward collective solutions, institutional rebuilding, and social solidarity in the face of crisis. Much like their GI generation great-grandparents, the pattern repeats across centuries. This is why reading history isn't enough. Each generation must relive it, in new forms but with familiar patterns. The Strauss-Howe theory isn't just descriptive, it's predictive. In their 1997 book, The Fourth Turning, they anticipated that around 2020, America would enter a period of crisis comparable to the Civil War and World War II, a time when institutional trust would collapse, when the unthinkable would become commonplace, when society would fundamentally transform. Sound familiar? They wrote. The Fourth Turning is a crisis, a decisive era of secular upheaval, when the values regime propels the replacement of the old civic order with a new one. They predicted this would begin with a catalyst event, a shocking moment that crystallizes a generation's worst fears and accelerates the movement toward crisis. They couldn't know whether that catalyst would be economic collapse, pandemic, terrorist attack, or something else entirely. But they knew it would come, and come it did. Whether you place the catalyst at 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, the 2016 election, or the 2020 pandemic, we are clearly living through what Strauss and Howe would recognize as a fourth turning. The crisis is here, but if this cycle is inevitable, what's the point of understanding it? Are we simply doomed to repeat the same mistakes, generation after generation, crisis after crisis without end? Not necessarily. While we may not escape the cycle entirely, awareness offers us something valuable: perspective. When we understand the generational forces shaping our moment, we gain context. We see that our present troubles, however severe, are part of a larger pattern. We recognize that crisis, while painful, also creates possibility. The opportunity to rebuild, to establish new institutions, to forge new consensus. The generations that emerge from crisis, like those who built the American Republic after Revolution, or those who created the post-war order after World War II, have a rare opportunity. They can shape institutions that will endure for decades. They can establish principles that guide society through the next seculum. But there's a darker implication too. If the cycle is real, and if we are indeed in the crisis phase, then the worst may still lie ahead. The climactic moments of previous crisis periods, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II, came several years into the phase. If the pattern holds, we may face challenges even more severe than what we've experienced so far. This isn't prophecy, it's pattern recognition. It's understanding that the forces driving our present moment are larger than any individual, larger than any political party or movement. They are the tides of history, and they carry us whether we recognize them or not. So where does this leave us? Are we merely passengers on a predetermined journey, unable to alter our course? Here's the final twist. The cycle shapes our options, but it doesn't eliminate our agency. We still choose how we respond to the challenges of our era. The decisions we make still matter, even if the broad contours of our time are set by forces beyond our control. Think of it like sailing. We can't control the tide or the wind, but we can adjust our sails. We can navigate the currents. We can't choose the sea, but we can choose our response to it. The crisis periods throughout history have brought both cataclysm and renewal. Which predominates depends not on the cycle itself, but on the wisdom and character of those living through it, on their ability to balance firmness with compassion, innovation with tradition, individual rights with collective responsibility. History offers examples of both possibilities. The American Revolution produced a constitutional democracy that has endured for centuries. The French Revolution descended into terror and dictatorship before finding stability. The Russian Revolution created a totalitarian regime that brought untold suffering. The New Deal and post-World War II settlement created prosperity and relative peace for decades. Same cyclical position, different outcomes. What determines which path a society takes during crisis? Leadership matters enormously. The presence of Washington rather than Robespierre, of Lincoln rather than Jefferson Davis, of Roosevelt rather than Hoover made all the difference. But leadership emerges from culture, from values, from the character of a people. A society that enters crisis with some reservoir of civic virtue, some capacity for compromise, some commitment to truth and the common good. Such a society can navigate crisis toward renewal rather than destruction. This is why understanding the cycle matters, not because it lets us escape it, but because it helps us prepare for its challenges. It reminds us to strengthen the civic virtues we'll need when crisis tests us most severely. It helps us recognize the moment we're in and respond appropriately. There's wisdom in embracing the role history has assigned us. The high generation builds institutions. The awakening generation challenges values. The unraveling generation navigates decay. The crisis generation transforms society through struggle. Each role is necessary. Each has its wisdom and its blindness. By understanding where we stand in the cycle, we can compensate for our generational blind spots. We can listen more carefully to the voices of those shaped by different phases. We can bring more consciousness to our moment. In other words, it depends on us. Understanding the Strauss-Howe cycle doesn't free us from responsibility. It heightens it. It tells us that we live in one of those rare moments when the decisions of a single generation will echo for a century, when institutions will be remade, when a new social contract will be written. What will that contract say? What values will it enshrine? What balance will it strike between liberty and community, between innovation and stability, between present consumption and future sustainability? These questions aren't determined by the cycle. They're determined by us. We face challenges our great-grandparents would recognize: inequality, polarization, institutional failure, international disorder. But we face them with technologies and capabilities they couldn't imagine. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, instant global communication, nuclear weapons, the capacity to alter Earth's climate. The stakes of our crisis are higher than any previous generation faced. The potential for both catastrophe and renewal is greater. Perhaps this is the true lesson of the Strauss-Howe theory. Not that history condemns us to endless repetition, but that it offers each generation its moment to write a chapter in humanity's ongoing story. Our chapter comes during a crisis. That much seems set, but the content of that chapter, its wisdom or foolishness, its violence or restraint, its vision or myopia, that remains unwritten. We can learn from the mistakes of previous crisis generations without being bound by them. We can recognize the patterns without being imprisoned by them. We can use our awareness of the cycle to move through it more consciously, more humanely than those who came before us. History doesn't just rhyme. It offers us the opportunity to improve the verse, to learn from the past without being chained to it, to recognize the patterns without being defeated by them. The cycle will continue. Another high will follow this crisis. Another awakening will follow that high. The rhythm of generations will persist. But the quality of each era, its justice, its compassion, its wisdom, that varies, that evolves, that can improve if we choose to improve it. So the question isn't whether we can escape the cycle, it's whether we can elevate it, whether we can face our moment with greater wisdom than our ancestors faced theirs, whether we can bequeath to our great-grandchildren a cycle less destructive, more just, more sustainable than the one we inherited. That's our challenge. Not to break the cycle, but to refine it. Not to escape history, but to improve it. If this exploration of history's rhythms has made you think, challenged your assumptions, and sparked a deeper curiosity about the forces shaping our world, then make sure to subscribe. Don't forget to hit the like button and share this video with those who need to understand the extraordinary moment we're living through. Because knowledge of the pattern, while not enough to break it, is the first step toward navigating it wisely. We can't choose our time, but we can choose what we do with it.